The air inside the Juilliard pre-college division audition hall felt thick, like walking into a room where everyone had been holding their breath for hours. Outside, New York City buzzed with its usual chaos, horns blaring, people shouting, subway trains rumbling beneath the pavement. But in here, silence ruled, the kind of silence that made your heartbeat sound too loud. 13-year-old Matteo stood just inside the doorway, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished wood floor. He wore a second-hand button-down shirt, neatly pressed but slightly too big, and black dress pants held up by a belt with a cracked buckle. In one hand, he clutched a single sheet of paper, his audition piece printed from a library computer and folded so many times the creases were starting to tear. His palms were sweaty. He wiped them on his thighs, then immediately regretted it when he saw the faint smudges left behind. He'd taken 3 buses and walked 15 blocks to get here. Left home before sunrise, tiptoeing past his sleeping mother so he wouldn't wake her. She'd worked the night shift again, cleaning offices downtown, and he didn't want her to worry. Not today. Today was the day he'd been dreaming about since he was 8 years old. The day he first heard a Chopin nocturne playing from an open window while walking home from school. He'd stopped dead in his tracks, frozen on the sidewalk like someone had hit pause on the whole world. From that moment on, the piano wasn't just an instrument to him, it was a voice. His voice. Now standing in front of the panel of judges, that voice felt trapped somewhere deep in his chest, too scared to come out. At the long table sat 5 people. All of them looked serious. All of them looked like they'd heard 1,000 kids play the same pieces 1,000 times. At the center sat a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing a dark blazer and glasses that perched low on her nose. She tapped a pen against her clipboard, not even looking up as Matteo approached. "Name?" she asked, voice flat. "Matteo Rivera," he said, voice cracking just slightly. He cleared his throat. "Matteo Rivera." She glanced at her list, then at him, then back at the list. Her expression didn't change. "You're late by 3 minutes. I'm sorry," Matteo stammered. "The bus? We don't accept excuses," she cut in, still not looking at him. "This is Juilliard. Punctuality is part of musicianship." Matteo nodded quickly, heart sinking. He'd practiced this moment in his head 100 times, walking in confident, bowing politely, sitting down like he belonged. But now, under the weight of her cold stare and the quiet judgment of the room, he felt like an intruder. Like he'd wandered into the wrong building by mistake. One of the other judges, a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, leaned forward slightly. "What will you be playing for us today, Matteo?" "Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, Opus 66, Matteo said, a little stronger this time. He'd memorized it weeks ago, but he kept the sheet music just in case his mind went blank. A few eyebrows lifted. The Fantaisie Impromptu wasn't beginner material. It was fast, intricate, full of emotional turns and technical landmines. Most kids his age stuck to simpler sonatinas or beginner etudes. This was a bold choice. The woman in the center finally looked up. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. The too big shirt, the scuffed shoes, the nervous way he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "And who is your teacher?" she asked. Matteo swallowed. I don't have one." Silence. The woman blinked. "You mean you study independently?" "No," Matteo said quietly. I've never had a piano lesson." Now the whole panel turned to look at him. Even the kind-eyed man looked surprised. "You're self-taught?" another judge asked, voice tinged with disbelief. Matteo nodded. "I learned from videos, YouTube, and I practiced on a keyboard my neighbor gave us. It only had 61 keys, and some of the notes didn't work right, but He stopped himself. He could hear how it sounded, like a kid making excuses. Like he was trying to explain why he didn't belong here. The woman in the center let out a short, dry laugh. She turned to the man beside her and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." The other judges chuckled. Not cruelly exactly, but the kind of laugh people give when they've heard something so absurd it's almost funny. Like someone claiming they built a spaceship in their garage. Matteo's face burned. He wanted to turn around and walk out. To disappear into the hallway and never come back. But then he thought of his mother, sleeping on the couch with her shoes still on, exhausted from another double shift. He thought of the nights he stayed up late, pressing his ear against the thin wall of their apartment, listening to the muffled sound of a neighbor's piano through the floorboards. He thought of how he'd saved every dollar from helping neighbors carry groceries just to print sheet music at the library. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here because the music wouldn't let him stay away. Without another word, he walked to the grand piano at the front of the room, a gleaming black Steinway that looked like it cost more than his entire building. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their smooth, cool surface. Real ivory, real wood, not the sticky plastic of his old keyboard. He sat down. For a moment, he just breathed, closed his eyes. Let the noise in his head, the fear, the doubt, the echo of that laugh, fade into the background. Then he began. The first notes were soft, hesitant, like someone stepping onto thin ice, testing if it would hold. But as the melody unfolded, something shifted. His fingers found their rhythm. His shoulders relaxed. The music wasn't perfect. There were missed notes, moments where his left hand lagged behind his right. But none of that mattered. Because what poured out of him wasn't just notes on a page. It was longing. It was hope. It was the sound of a boy who'd spent years listening to the world through a cracked window, finally given a chance to speak back. The room changed. The chuckles stopped. The pen stopped tapping. Even the woman who'd laughed, Director Eleanor Whitmore, though Mateo didn't know her name yet, sat perfectly still, her pen frozen mid-air. She'd expected noise, clumsy banging, maybe a few recognizable phrases strung together with effort. What she heard instead was something raw and alive, music that didn't just move through the keys but through the air, through the walls, through the people in the room. Mateo didn't notice any of it. He was lost in the storm of the piece, the swirling arpeggios, the sudden bursts of passion, the quiet moments that felt like secrets whispered in the dark. He played like no one was watching, like he was alone in his room at 2 a.m., with only the streetlight outside and the hum of the refrigerator for company. When he reached the final chords, his hands hovered over the keys for a heartbeat before letting them fall. The last note hung in the air, trembling, then faded into silence. No one moved, no one breathed. Then slowly, the kind-eyed judge leaned forward and whispered, "Again." Mateo opened his eyes, startled. "Again?" "Yes," the man said, voice thick with something Mateo couldn't name. "Please." But before Mateo could respond, Director Whitmore stood up. Her face was pale. Her usual composure, so sharp, so controlled, had cracked. She didn't kneel, not yet, but she did something almost as shocking. She walked around the table, stepped down from the raised platform, and stood just a few feet from the piano. She looked at Mateo, not at his clothes, not at his background, not at his lack of credentials, but at him. Really looked. "Where did you learn to feel like that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. Mateo shrugged, suddenly shy again. "I don't know, I just... Listen." She nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense. As if for the first time in years, someone had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for the perfection, not for the prestige, but for the truth it carried. "Thank you," she said simply. And for the first time that day, Mateo believed he might actually belong here. He didn't know it yet. But this moment, the laughter, the doubt, the music that silenced them all, would become the beginning of something much bigger. Not just for him, but for the woman who'd laughed, and for everyone who would one day hear his story. But right now, all he knew was the quiet hum of the piano still vibrating in his fingertips, and the strange, warm feeling in his chest that told him, "You showed them. You really showed them." The silence after the last note faded wasn't the kind you could ignore. It wasn't polite. It wasn't waiting. It was heavy, like the whole room had stopped breathing at once. Mateo kept his hands resting on the keys, eyes still closed, not sure if he should move. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Had he messed up? Was it worse than he thought? Then came the voice, soft, almost hesitant. Again. Mateo opened his eyes. The man with the kind eyes was leaning forward, elbows on the table, fingers steepled under his chin. His expression wasn't mocking or bored. It was just curious, like he'd just heard something he couldn't quite explain. "Play it again," the man said, quieter this time, as if afraid speaking too loud might break the spell. Mateo glanced at the woman who'd laughed, the one in the center. She hadn't moved. Her pen was still frozen in midair, her glasses slightly crooked on her nose. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't frowning either. She just looked stunned. He swallowed. His fingers were starting to ache from tension, and his back felt stiff from sitting so straight. But he nodded. "Okay." He took a slow breath, reset his hands, and began again. This time something was different. Not in the music, but in him. The fear was still there, coiled tight in his stomach, but it wasn't in control anymore. Now there was something else underneath it. A quiet certainty. He knew this piece. Not just the notes, but the spaces between them. The sighs, the pauses, the way the melody climbed like someone reaching for something just out of reach. He'd lived inside this music for months. It wasn't foreign to him. It was home. As his fingers moved, the room seemed to shrink. The judges, the fancy piano, the intimidating walls covered in portraits of famous composers, all of it blurred into the background. It was just him and the keys, like always. But this time, someone was really listening. Halfway through, he hit a tricky run, a fast cascade of notes that always gave him trouble on his old keyboard because two of the middle C keys stuck. On this piano, the keys responded instantly, perfectly. The run came out clean, fluid, like water pouring over smooth stones. He almost smiled. When he finished the second time, the silence returned, but it felt warmer now. Less like judgment, more like awe. The kind-eyed man exhaled slowly. "Good heavens," he murmured. One of the other judges, a woman with short gray hair and a sharp gaze, leaned over to the woman in the center and whispered something Matteo couldn't hear. The woman, Director Whitmore, didn't answer right away. She just stared at Matteo like she was trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Finally, she spoke. "You've never had a lesson?" "Not one." Matteo shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not even online? No Zoom classes? No summer camps?" "No, just videos. And listening. A lot of listening." She frowned slightly, as if trying to reconcile what she'd just heard with everything she thought she knew about how talent worked. In her world, prodigies didn't appear out of thin air. They were groomed, trained, polished from the moment they could reach the pedals. They came from music schools, from families who owned grand pianos and hired private coaches before kindergarten. This boy, he came from somewhere else entirely. "Where do you practice?" she asked. "At home. Well, not really at her home. We don't have a piano. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, she used to play. She gave us this old keyboard when she moved to Florida. It's missing some keys and the volume knob's broken, so I have to use headphones most of the time." "And you learned Chopin? On a broken keyboard?" Matteo nodded. "I watched videos of people playing it. Over and over. I'd pause, rewind, try to copy their hands. Sometimes I'd stay up until 3 in the morning just trying to get one measure right." The gray-haired woman made a small sound. Half sigh, half hum of disbelief. "That's extraordinary." Director Whitmore didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at him, really looked as if seeing him for the first time, not as a late, underdressed kid with no training, but as someone who carried music inside him like a second heartbeat. "Do you know why Chopin wrote this piece?" she asked suddenly. Matteo hesitated. I read that he never published it, that he thought it was too personal, too emotional." She nodded slowly. "He called it too showy. But it wasn't showy for show's sake. It was showy because he couldn't hold it in, like the music was bursting out of him." She paused, then added almost to herself, "You played it like you understand that." Matteo didn't know what to say. He just shrugged. "I guess. When you don't have words, you use music." That seemed to hit her harder than anything else. Her shoulders softened just a little. The sharp edge in her eyes dulled. The kind-eyed man cleared his throat. "Would you mind playing something else?" "Anything you'd like. Just a minute or two." Matteo thought for a second. He didn't have another piece memorized, not fully. But there was one thing he always played when he needed to calm down. Something simple. Something his mother used to hum when she was tired. He placed his hands back on the keys and began. It was just a folk tune. Something old, passed down through generations in his family. No fancy chords, no lightning-fast runs. Just a gentle melody, warm and steady like a lullaby. He played it softly, letting the notes breathe, adding little turns and grace notes the way his abuela used to sing it. As he played, he thought of his mother's hands, rough from cleaning, but always gentle when she tucked him in at night. He thought of Sunday mornings when she'd make pancakes and let him play the radio, dancing in the kitchen even when she was exhausted. He poured all of that into the music. When he stopped, no one spoke for nearly 10 seconds. Then Director Whitmore stood up, not to leave, not to end the audition. She walked slowly around the table, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She stopped a few feet from the piano and looked down at him. Not down in the way adults sometimes do to kids. Like they're smaller or less important, but straight on, eye to eye. "You're accepted," she said. Mateo blinked. "What?" "You're in. Full scholarship. Starting next semester." He stared at her, mouth slightly open. "But I'm not ready. I don't know theory. I can't read music that well." You have something more important," she interrupted gently. "You have a voice, and we don't teach that here. We protect it, nurture it, help it grow." She glanced back at the panel. They all nodded. Even the sternest-looking one, but what about the other kids? "The ones who've been training for years? They'll learn technique," she said. "You'll teach them feeling." Mateo didn't cry, not then. But his eyes got hot, and his throat tightened so much he could barely swallow. He'd dreamed of this moment, sure, but he never imagined it would feel like this, not like winning, but like being seen. "Thank you," he whispered. She gave a small nod, then turned back to the table. But before she sat down, she paused and added almost as an afterthought, "And Mateo, yes, don't ever stop listening." Later, as he walked out of the building, the city noise rushed back in. Cars honking, people talking, a street musician playing saxophone on the corner. But everything felt different now. The air felt lighter. The sun, peeking through the tall buildings, felt warmer. He pulled out his phone, old cracked screen, battery at 12%, and dialed his mother. She answered on the second ring, voice groggy. "Mijo, everything okay?" He took a deep breath. "I got in," a pause. Then, "Got in." "Where?" "Juilliard. The pre-college program. Full scholarship," silence. Then a soft sob. "You're joking." "I'm not." "Oh, Dios mío." Her voice broke. "I knew you were special. I always knew." He smiled, looking up at the sky. "I just played, Mama, that's all." "That's everything," she whispered. They talked for a few more minutes about logistics, about what he'd need, about how they'd manage. But beneath all the practical questions, there was something deeper. Pride. Pure, unshakable pride. When he hung up, he stood on the sidewalk for a long time, just breathing. He thought about the woman who'd laughed. He didn't feel angry at her anymore. In fact, he almost understood. She'd spent her life in a world where music came with rules, with pedigrees, with resumes. She hadn't been cruel, just blind to the idea that genius could wear worn-out sneakers and ride 3 buses to get here. But now she'd seen it. And that changed everything. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. Papers arrived in the mail. Acceptance letters, forms to sign, lists of required supplies. His mother stayed up late filling them out, double-checking every line. Neighbors heard the news and started stopping by with small gifts. A metronome from the retired music teacher down the hall, a used music stand from the church choir director, even a pair of proper black dress shoes from the deli owner who'd watched Mateo grow up. At school, kids treated him differently, not with jealousy, but with a kind of quiet respect. Even the teachers seemed to look at him like he'd grown an extra inch overnight. But the strangest part was the piano. Juilliard sent someone to deliver a small, upright piano to their apartment. A loaner for the summer, until classes started. When the movers brought it in, his mother cried again. Not from sadness, but from disbelief. "We have a real piano," she kept saying, running her hand over the polished wood like it was sacred. That night, Mateo sat at it for hours, not practicing audition pieces, not trying to impress anyone, just playing. Songs he made up, tunes he remembered from childhood, even silly little melodies just to hear how they sounded on real strings and hammers instead of plastic keys. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was borrowing music. He felt like he owned it. Back at Juilliard, Director Whitmore couldn't stop thinking about him. She'd reviewed hundreds of auditions that season. Talented kids, disciplined kids, kids with perfect pitch and flawless technique. But none of them had done what this boy did. None of them had made her forget she was judging. None of them had made her remember why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not as a career, not as a competition, but as a way to say the things words never could. She mentioned him at a faculty meeting. "We have a new student," she said. "Completely self-taught, raw, but there's something there. I want him placed with Elena Martinez for private lessons." Elena was known for her patience and her ear for emotional truth in music. "She didn't just teach notes, she taught stories. Are you sure?" someone asked. "He'll be behind in theory," Sight reading, technique. He's ahead in what matters most, Whitmore replied simply, and that was that. But she didn't tell them the real reason she'd fought for him. It was because, for the first time in years, she'd felt humbled. Not by a famous soloist, not by a visiting maestro, but by a 13-year-old boy in a too-big shirt who played like his. Heart was on fire. She hadn't knelt that day, but part of her had, and she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The first day of classes at Juilliard felt like stepping onto another planet. Everything was polished, floors, instruments, even the way people spoke. Students moved through the halls with a quiet confidence, backpacks full of sheet music, fingers always twitching like they were practicing in the air. They greeted each other with nods and quick smiles, already part of a world Matteo had only ever watched from the outside. He wore the same black pants from his audition, but his shirt was new, bought with money his mother had saved from skipping lunch for 2 weeks. His shoes still pinched a little, but he didn't complain. He just walked in, head down, clutching his folder like a shield. His first class was music theory. He sat in the back, hoping to disappear. The teacher wrote symbols on the board, clefs, key signatures, time signatures, and started explaining intervals. Matteo tried to follow, but it was like listening to a language he'd never heard before. Everyone else scribbled notes like it was second nature. One girl raised her hand and asked a question about harmonic minor scales, and the teacher nodded approvingly. Matteo didn't even know what a scale was, not by name. At break, he stood alone by the water fountain, sipping slowly to make it last. A group of students passed by, laughing about a recital they'd played together last summer in Switzerland. One of them glanced at him, then whispered something to the others. They didn't mean to be cruel, he knew that. But their ease, their shared history, made him feel like an imposter in his own dream. He thought about the piano in his apartment, the one that now sat in their tiny living room like a miracle. He'd played it every night since it arrived, sometimes until his fingers ached. But here, even the practice rooms had names on the doors. Reserved, scheduled. Nothing was free. Nothing was just yours. His first private lesson with Elena Martinez was the next day. He arrived 10 minutes early and sat outside her studio, heart pounding. When she opened the door, she didn't look like the other teachers. She wore jeans and a faded sweater, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She smiled. Not the polite smile of someone doing their job, but a real one. Warm and open. "You must be Matteo," she said. He nodded. "Come in." Her studio was small but cozy, bookshelves crammed with scores, a potted plant in the corner, a well-loved armchair by the window, and in the center another grand piano, though not as shiny as the one in the audition hall. "Play something for me," she said, sitting in the armchair. "Anything. Don't think. Just play." He hesitated. "Shouldn't we start with scales? Or something?" She shook her head. "Scales come later. First, I want to hear you." So he played the folk tune again, the one he'd played for the panel, the one his mother hummed. As his fingers moved, Elena closed her eyes. When he finished, she opened them slowly and said, "That's your truth, isn't it?" He didn't know how to answer, so he just nodded. "Good," she said. "We'll build everything else on that." But building wasn't easy. Over the next few weeks, the gap between him and the other students became impossible to ignore. In ear training, he struggled to identify chords. In sight reading, he stumbled over basic rhythms. During ensemble rehearsal, he kept missing cues because he was still counting in his head while everyone else just felt it. One afternoon, after a particularly rough theory quiz, he'd scored 42%, he sat on a bench outside the building, staring at the sidewalk. Rain had started to fall, light and steady, but he didn't move. He just let it dampen his hair, his shirt, his shoes. He thought about quitting. Not because he didn't love music. He loved it more than ever. But because he was tired of feeling like he was running uphill in the dark, while everyone else had flashlights and maps. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his mother. "How was class, mijo?" He stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "Fine." He couldn't tell her. Not yet. She'd worked too hard. Believed too much. He didn't want to be the reason her hope turned into disappointment. That night, he didn't touch the piano. He lay in bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional shout from the street below. For the first time since he'd started playing, Music felt like a weight instead of wings. Back at Juilliard, Elena noticed. She saw how he lingered after class, asking quiet questions. How he stayed late in the practice room, repeating the same measure over and over until his hands cramped. How his eyes darted to the clock during theory, like he was counting the minutes until he could escape. One day, she asked him to stay after their lesson. "Tell me about your home," she said, not looking at him, pretending to organize sheet music. He shrugged. "It's small. 2 rooms. My mom sleeps on the couch, and the piano. Where is it?" "In the living room. Right by the window." She moved the TV to the corner so it wouldn't block the light. Elena smiled faintly. "She must be proud." "She is," he said softly. "Too proud, maybe? What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I don't want her to find out I'm not good enough." Elena turned to face him. "Who told you that?" "No one. I just see it. Everyone here knows things I don't. They talk about composers like they're old friends. They've played in orchestras. I've never even been to a real concert." "You've never been to a concert?" she asked, surprised. "Not one where I had a ticket. I've stood outside Lincoln Center before, listening through the doors. Once I heard a violinist warming up, and I stayed for an hour." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Talent isn't about where you've been. It's about where you're willing to go." She walked to her desk and pulled out a small key. "This opens practice room 7. It's at the end of the hall near the fire exit. It's not on the schedule. No one uses it because the light flickers. But it's yours every day after 6 p.m. until 9, no questions asked." Matteo stared at the key. "Why?" "Because you need space to catch up. And because I believe you'll use it wisely." He took the key. It was cold and heavy in his palm. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Now go home and tell your mother the truth." That night he did. He sat at the kitchen table while his mother washed dishes. Steam rose from the sink, fogging the window. "I'm struggling," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She turned off the water and dried her hands on her apron. "I know. You do? I see it in your eyes when you come home. You think I don't notice?" He looked down. "I don't want to let you down." She walked over and knelt in front of him, just like the director had joked she would, though no one knew it yet. She took his hands in hers. They were rough, calloused from work, but warm. "Mijo," she said, "you could never let me down. Do you know why I work double shifts? Not so you'd be perfect, so you'd have a chance. That's all." He felt tears well up but blinked them away. "I feel like I don't belong there." "Then make it belong to you," she said simply. "You didn't get in because you're like them. You got in because you don't forget that." The next evening he went to practice room 7. The light did flicker, annoying at first, but after a while he stopped noticing. The piano was older, slightly out of tune, but it had character. It felt honest. He started with the basics: scales, arpeggios, rhythm exercises. He printed free theory worksheets from the library computer and drilled them until the notes started to make sense. He recorded himself playing and listened back, cringing at the mistakes but also hearing progress. Tiny, slow, but real. Some nights Elena would stop by, knock softly, and sit in the corner with a cup of tea. She never interrupted, just listened. Sometimes she'd leave a note on the piano. "Try this fingering. Listen to this recording. You're closer than you think." Other nights he was alone, just him, the flickering light, and the music. One rainy Thursday he stayed past 9. He was working on a Bach invention, simple, clean, mathematical. He'd never liked Bach before. Too rigid, too cold. But tonight something clicked. He realized Bach wasn't cold. He was precise. And in that precision, there was beauty, like watching gears turn in a perfect clock. He played it 3 times, each time smoother, clearer. When he finally packed up, he felt tired, but not defeated. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was building something, not just chasing it. Meanwhile, Director Whitmore had been watching from a distance. She didn't interfere, didn't check his grades or call his teachers, but she made sure his scholarship covered everything: books, concert tickets, even a new pair of headphones. She arranged for him to attend a weekend workshop with a visiting jazz pianist, knowing his roots were in listening, not just reading. She also started visiting the neighborhood, not to spy. Not to judge, but to understand. She walked the blocks around his building, past bodegas and laundromats, past kids playing basketball in the street. She saw the school he attended, the library where he printed music, the bus stop where he waited in the rain. One afternoon, she sat on a bench across from his apartment building. She didn't go in, didn't knock, just watched as his mother came home from work, shoulders slumped but smiling when she saw a neighbor's child. Whitmore realized something then. This boy's music didn't come from a vacuum. It came from love, from sacrifice, from 1,000 small acts of courage most people never saw, and that was worth more than perfect technique. Back in class, things didn't magically get easier. But Mateo stopped comparing himself. Instead of measuring his progress against others, he measured it against who he was yesterday. He still got nervous before ensemble. Still mixed up minor and major keys sometimes, but now when he played, he didn't try to sound like someone else. He played like himself, imperfect, searching but true. One day during a group rehearsal, the conductor stopped everyone. "Mateo," he said. "That phrase, you played it differently than written." Mateo froze. I'm sorry. I'll fix it." "No," the conductor said. "Don't fix it. Tell me why you changed it," Mateo swallowed. "It just felt like it needed to breathe there." Like the music was holding its breath, the conductor nodded slowly. "Good, keep it." The other students looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something new, respect. He wasn't catching up to them. He was showing them a different path. And for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Learning, growing and slowly, quietly, becoming the musician only he could be. At first, she didn't mean to get involved. She'd done her part, accepted him, arranged his placement, made sure the scholarship held. That was the job. The rest was up to him, his teachers, his own grit. But something about that audition wouldn't leave her alone. Not the music itself, though, that had been startling enough. It was the look in his eyes when he finished, like he'd just given away something precious and wasn't sure if it had been worth it. So she started paying attention, not in a way anyone would notice. She didn't hover, didn't call his teachers for updates, but she made sure his name stayed on her radar. When the theory department flagged him as at risk, she quietly asked Elena to keep him in her studio. When concert tickets were being handed out for student performances, she made sure he got a pair, even though he hadn't earned them through seniority like the others. Small things, invisible things, the kind of support that doesn't show up on a report card but changes everything. Then came the parent-teacher conference. It wasn't required for pre-college students, but she'd started holding them anyway, just 15 minutes per family to build trust. When his mother arrived, she was early, dressed in her cleaning uniform, hair pulled back, hands still red from bleach. She looked nervous, standing in the hallway like she wasn't sure she was allowed inside. Director Whitmore met her at the door. "Please come in." The woman stepped in carefully as if the floor might crack beneath her. She didn't sit right away, just stood near the chair, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "You've done so much for my son," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." Whitmore gestured to the chair again. "Sit, please." "And it's not me. He earned his place. But you saw him when no one else would." That hit harder than Whitmore expected. She looked down at her desk, at the stack of files, at the polished nameplate that said Director of Admissions. For years, she'd believed her job was to find the best, the most polished, the most prepared, the ones who fit the mold. But this boy had shattered the mold, and she'd been the one who almost missed him. "I was wrong," she admitted, voice quieter than usual. "That day in the audition room, I laughed. Not because I thought he was foolish, but because I couldn't imagine talent like his existing outside the world I knew." His mother didn't look angry. She just nodded like she understood something deeper. He's always been like that. Even as a baby, he'd stop crying when music played. Not any music, only the sad kind. Like he felt it in his bones. Whitmore leaned forward. "Tell me about your home." And so she did. She talked about the apartment with the thin walls and the broken radiator. About working nights so he could sleep through the quiet hours. About saving for months to buy him noise-canceling headphones so he wouldn't disturb the neighbors while practicing. About how she'd never taken a music class herself. But she knew when her son was hurting, because his playing would get slower, softer, like he was wrapping the notes in cotton. He doesn't play to impress, she said. He plays to survive. Whitmore felt something shift inside her, like a door she didn't know was closed had finally opened. After the meeting, she didn't go back to her office right away. She walked down to the practice wing, past rows of closed doors, each one humming with scales and sonatas. She stopped outside practice room 7, the one with the flickering light, and listened. Inside, he was playing Debussy. Not perfectly, but with a kind of dreamy curiosity, like he was discovering the piece for the first time. She stayed there for nearly 10 minutes just listening through the door. Then she made a decision. The next week, she called a meeting with the development office. "I want to create a new outreach program," she said. "Not just scholarships, real access. Instruments for students who can't afford them. Transportation stipends. Weekend workshops in underserved neighborhoods. And I want Mateo involved, not as a poster child, but as a voice." People were skeptical. "It's expensive," someone said, "and risky. What if it doesn't work?" "It already is working," she replied. "We just haven't been paying attention." She didn't tell them it was personal. She didn't say that every time she heard him play, she remembered her own first piano, a second-hand upright in a cold apartment, her mother working 2 jobs so she could take lessons. She'd forgotten that part of her story, buried it under degrees and titles and polished resumes, but this boy had dug it back up. Meanwhile, Mateo started noticing changes. His mother came home one evening with a gift card for new sheet music. "From the school," she said, though she looked puzzled. A week later, a technician showed up to tune the piano, free of charge. Then Elena mentioned that Juilliard was starting a new community concert series, and they wanted him to perform at the first one. "Me?" he asked, stunned. "You," she said. "They're holding it at a community center in the Bronx, your neighborhood." He wanted to say no. The thought of playing in front of people who knew him, not as a Juilliard student but as the quiet kid from 183rd Street, terrified him. What if he disappointed them? What if they saw through the fancy school and realized he was still just him, but his mother said, "You have to do it." Why? Because someone in that room might be you, just starting out, listening through a wall, dreaming. And they need to see that it's possible. So he said yes. The night of the concert, the community center was packed, not with donors in suits, but with families, kids in sneakers, elders in folding chairs, neighbors who'd watched him grow up. His old math teacher was there, the bodega owner who'd given him free empanadas on tough days. Even Mrs. Chen, who'd sent the keyboard from Florida, had come back for the weekend. He played the Fantasia Impromptu again, but this time it wasn't for judges. It was for them, for the boy he used to be, for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Afterward, a little girl, maybe 7 years old, ran up to him, eyes wide. "Can you teach me?" she asked. He knelt down. "Do you have a piano?" She shook her head. "But I have a tablet and headphones," he smiled. "Then you already have everything you need." Back at Juilliard, something else was changing. Director Whitmore started visiting his neighborhood, not as a guest, but as a listener. She sat in on a local church choir rehearsal. She attended a block party. She even helped organize a small piano donation drive, collecting old keyboards and getting them repaired for kids who couldn't afford lessons. One Saturday morning, she showed up at his building with a box of sheet music and a thermos of coffee. His mother answered the door, surprised but not shocked, like she'd been expecting this moment all along. "I wanted to see where the music lives," Whitmore said simply. They sat at the kitchen table. No titles, no roles, just 2 women who loved the same boy in different ways. "He's scared," his mother admitted. "Not of failing, but of forgetting where he came from." Whitmore nodded. "I used to be afraid of that too. I changed my accent, my clothes, my whole way of speaking just to fit in. But the music never let me forget. It always brought me back." They talked for hours about sacrifice, about pride, about the quiet courage it takes to raise a dreamer in a world that doesn't always make space for them. Before she left, Whitmore looked at the piano by the window. "May I?" His mother gestured to it. Of course, Whitmore sat down. She hadn't played publicly in years, not since she became an administrator. Her fingers were stiff at first, but then she began a simple Bach prelude, clean, precise, but with a new softness underneath. When she finished, she didn't say anything. Just closed the lid gently and stood up. "Thank you," she said to his mother. "For what?" "For reminding me that music isn't about perfection. It's about connection." From then on, their relationship changed. She stopped being just the director. To him, she became someone who showed up, not to fix him, but to stand beside him. She attended his recitals not in the front row with the donors, but in the back, where no one would notice. She sent him recordings of old jazz pianists who'd also started with nothing. She even apologized once quietly after a masterclass. "I'm sorry I laughed that day." He shook his head. "You didn't laugh at me. You laughed at your own assumptions. That's different." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes he recognized. Humility, and that made all the difference. Because now when he walked into Juilliard, he didn't feel like an outsider trying to prove himself. He felt like someone who belonged, not in spite of where he came from, but because of it. And the woman who once joked she'd kneel if he played the piano, she was starting to understand that the real kneeling wasn't about pride or punishment. It was about reverence, for the music, for the journey, for the quiet, stubborn miracle of a boy who turned doubt into song, and in doing so changed everything. The gala was held in Juilliard's main concert hall, the same room where auditions happened, but transformed. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, velvet curtains framed the stage, and rows of polished seats filled with people in evening wear, donors in tuxedos, critics with notepads, faculty members with proud smiles. It was the kind of night where reputations were made, careers launched, legacies sealed. But tonight wasn't about any of that, at least not for Matteo. He stood backstage wearing a simple black suit, new but not flashy, and running his fingers over the keys of the Steinway one last time. He wasn't nervous, not exactly. The fear that used to coil in his stomach before playing had changed. It wasn't gone, but it had shape now. Purpose. He knew why he was here. Not to impress. Not to prove he belonged, but to say thank you. In the only language that ever made sense to him. He'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. Not because it was showy, though it could be, but because it carried weight. It started low and dark like walking through a storm, then rose into something fierce and aching, before ending in quiet resolve. It felt like his story, like his mother's story, like the story of every kid who'd ever pressed their ear to a wall, hoping to hear something beautiful through the noise of the world. Backstage, Elena found him. She didn't say much, just placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. "Play like no one's listening," she whispered. "Even though everyone is." He nodded, then came the announcement. His name echoed through the hall, followed by polite applause. He walked out slowly, eyes fixed on the piano, not the crowd. But as he passed the wings, he saw them. His entire building was there. Not just his mother, though she sat front and center wearing her best dress, hair neatly pinned back, but neighbors, shop owners, his old school principal, kids from the block, even the bus driver who always let him ride for free when he was late. They'd all been bussed in, seated together in a block of reserved seats near the front. Someone had organized it quietly. No fanfare. Just care. He saw the little girl from the community center, now holding a small notebook like she was going to write down every note. He saw Mrs. Chen dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and he saw Director Whitmore, standing at the side of the stage, not in the faculty section, but waiting, watching, like she had something to prove to herself. He sat at the piano. For a moment, he just breathed. Then he began. The first chords rolled out like thunder, deep, resonant, full of sorrow and strength. The hall fell utterly still. Even the rustle of programs stopped. He played with everything he had, not just his hands, but his heart, his history, his hope. There were moments where his fingers flew, racing through the storm, and others where he lingered on a single note, letting it hang in the air like a question. He thought of the broken keyboard. He thought of the library printer jamming on his sheet music. He thought of his mother falling asleep on the couch, shoes still on after another double shift. He thought of the flickering light in practice room 7. He thought of the day he almost quit, and he poured it all into the music. Halfway through, something shifted in the room. It wasn't just listening anymore, it was feeling. You could see it in the way people leaned forward, in the way some closed their eyes, in the way a few wiped their cheeks without embarrassment. When the final chord rang out, low, solemn, but not defeated, the silence lasted longer than any applause ever could. Then slowly, someone stood up. It was his mother. She didn't clap. She just stood, tears streaming down her face, hands pressed to her heart. One by one, others rose. Not the donors first, not the critics, but the people from his neighborhood, the ones who knew what this moment cost, the ones who'd seen him carry groceries for spare change, who'd heard him practicing through thin walls at midnight, who'd believed in him before the world even noticed he existed. Then the rest of the hall followed. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, but Mateo didn't look at them. He looked past them, to the side of the stage. Director Whitmore stood there, motionless, as the ovation swelled around her. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. And then, without hesitation, without fanfare, without a single word, she knelt. Not dramatically, not for show. Just knelt. Right there on the hardwood floor in front of everyone. It wasn't the joke she'd made a year ago. It wasn't mockery. It was reverence. A quiet, human acknowledgement that sometimes the most powerful music doesn't come from training or privilege, but from truth. Tears filled Mateo's eyes, but he didn't look away. He held her gaze for a long moment, then bowed his head slightly, not in pride, but in gratitude. Then he turned to the audience and pointed, not to the donors, not to the faculty, not even to the stage. He pointed straight to his mother, because she was his first audience, his first believer, the reason he ever dared to dream. The crowd followed his gesture. Cameras turned. People turned. And in that moment, she wasn't just a cleaning lady in a borrowed dress. She was the heart of the story. She covered her mouth with her hand and sobbed, quietly, beautifully, like she'd been holding that cry in for years. After the performance, there were no interviews, no press photos, no agents rushing backstage with contracts. Just people coming up to say thank you, real, simple thank yous. A young student whispered, "I'm from Queens. I've never been here before, but now I think, maybe I can try." An older man, a retired musician, shook his hand and said, "You reminded me why I started." Even the critics, usually sharp-tongued and measured, were uncharacteristically quiet. One simply said, "That wasn't a performance, that was a gift." Later, as the crowd thinned, Mateo found himself alone with Director Whitmore near the stage door. She'd stood back up, brushed off her skirt, and composed herself, but her eyes were still red. "You didn't have to kneel," he said softly. "Yes," she replied. "I did." They stood in silence for a moment, the city humming outside. "I used to think music was about excellence," she said, "about precision, discipline, legacy, and those things matter. But tonight, you reminded me it's also about humanity. About showing up broken and brave and saying, 'This is me.'" He nodded. "I just played what I felt." "That's the hardest thing to do," she said, "and the most important." In the weeks that followed, life didn't change in big, dramatic ways. Mateo still took the bus. His mother still worked nights. He still struggled with theory sometimes. But something had shifted, not in his circumstances, but in how he carried them. He started volunteering at the new community music program Juilliard had launched. Every Saturday, he taught a small group of kids in the Bronx how to read notes, how to listen, how to find their own voice, even on a broken keyboard. He didn't call it teaching, he called it sharing. His mother began attending his recitals regularly, not as a spectator but as part of the story. She even started humming along to the pieces he practiced, her voice soft but sure. And Director Whitmore? She kept her promise. The outreach program grew. More instruments were donated. More kids got chances. And every time a new student walked into an audition room, wearing secondhand clothes, clutching wrinkled sheet music, voice shaking, she remembered to look past the surface. She never laughed again. But she did something better. She listened. One evening, months later, Matteo sat at the piano in his living room. Rain tapped gently against the window. His mother was asleep on the couch, a book open on her lap. The city outside was quiet for once. He didn't play anything famous, didn't practice for an exam or a recital. He just played, a simple melody he'd made up that afternoon, about bus rides and library printers, and the sound of his mother's laugh. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was true. And in that moment, with the rain falling and the piano humming and the woman who loved him most resting peacefully nearby, he knew he'd already won. Not because he'd made it to Juilliard, not because he'd received a standing ovation, but because he'd stayed himself, through doubt, through fear, through every voice that said he didn't belong. The music hadn't changed him. It had revealed him. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. There was no grand announcement. No press release. No spotlight. It started quietly, like most real changes do, with a single conversation on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Matteo was packing up his sheet music after a lesson when Elena stopped him at the door. "The outreach program needs a student ambassador," she said, not looking up from her planner. "Someone who's been through it. Someone the kids can see themselves in." He hesitated. "Me?" "You're the reason it exists," she said simply. Not the only reason, but the spark. He didn't say yes right away. The idea of being a face for anything made him uneasy. He wasn't comfortable with attention, not the kind that put you on posters or in brochures. But then he thought of the little girl from the community center, the one who'd asked if she could learn on a tablet. He thought of the boys in his old neighborhood who rolled their eyes at piano but lit up when he played hip-hop beats on the keys. So he said yes, not as a star, but as a bridge. The first workshop under his guidance was held in a converted storage room at the local community center. Bare walls, folding chairs, one donated upright piano with a sticky E-flat key. 12 kids showed up, ages 8 to 15. Some wore headphones around their necks like badges. Others clutched notebooks filled with scribbled lyrics. None of them looked like they belonged in a conservatory. Matteo didn't start with scales or posture or music theory. He started with a question. "What does music sound like when you're sad?" he asked. Silence. Then a boy in the back said, "Like rain on a tin roof." A girl near the front whispered, "Like my mom humming when she thinks I'm asleep." He nodded. "That's where we begin." He showed them how to find those sounds on the piano, not by reading notes, but by listening. He played a simple chord and asked them to describe the feeling. "Heavy," one said. "Lonely," another offered. He taught them to mimic the rhythm of a heartbeat, the sigh of a bus braking, the bounce of a basketball on pavement. One kid, quiet and small, kept hanging back. After the session, he lingered while the others left. "You don't gotta be good to start," Matteo told him. "You just gotta start." The boy looked down. "My hands are too small," Matteo smiled. Chopin's were smaller than yours. He sat beside him and placed the boy's fingers on the keys. "Try this," it was just 3 notes. But when the boy played them, soft, unsure but real, his whole face changed. That night, Matteo walked home with a new kind of tired. Not the kind that came from practicing for hours, but the kind that came from giving something away and feeling lighter for it. Back at Juilliard, things were changing too. Slowly, quietly. Director Whitmore had started a new policy. Every audition now included a 5-minute free play segment. No prepared piece. No sheet music. Just sit and play whatever you want. "Let us hear you." Some faculty resisted. "It's not standardized," they argued. "How do we compare?" "We don't," she replied. "We listen." The first round under the new system brought in a girl who played steel drums from Trinidad, a boy who composed on a beatbox app, and a teenager who sang folk songs in a language no one in the room recognized, but everyone felt. Mateo wasn't involved in the auditions, but he heard about them. And when he passed the audition hall one day and heard a raw, untrained voice singing through the door, he paused. He didn't go in. He just stood there for a moment listening and smiled. His mother noticed the shift in him. "You're different," she said one evening, stirring a pot of beans on the stove. "How?" "You used to play to prove something. Now you play to give something." He didn't answer right away. He just watched her hands, the same hands that scrubbed floors, folded laundry, tucked him in at night, move with quiet rhythm. "Maybe I finally understand what music is for," he said. She turned and looked at him, eyes soft. "It's for people like us, the ones who need it most." Months passed. Seasons turned. Snow fell, melted, returned as rain, then gave way to spring. Mateo kept teaching on Saturdays. The group grew. They didn't all stick with piano, some moved to guitar, some to voice, some to production, but they kept coming back. Not because they wanted to be famous, but because for 2 hours every week they were seen, heard, valued. One Saturday the power went out during class. No lights, no electric keyboard. Just silence and the gray afternoon light through the windows. For a moment everyone froze. Then Mateo started clapping a rhythm, simple, steady. The kids joined in, stomping feet, snapping fingers, humming melodies. They made music out of nothing but themselves. Afterward, a girl said, "I didn't know we could do that." "You can always do that," he told her. "Music isn't in the instrument. It's in you." That summer, Juilliard invited him to perform at a national education conference, not as a prodigy, but as a speaker. They wanted him to talk about access, about talent beyond privilege, about how music finds its way through cracks in the wall. He almost said no. Public speaking terrified him more than any concert. But Elena said, "You don't have to give a speech. Just tell your truth." So he did. He stood on a stage in front of hundreds of teachers, administrators, and policymakers, and he didn't talk about technique, or discipline, or hours of practice. He talked about listening through walls, about saving bus fare to print sheet music, about the shame of wearing the same shoes to every recital, about the moment someone finally saw him, not as a problem to fix but as a voice to protect. When he finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It sat in silence for a long time. Then one teacher stood up, then another. Soon the whole room was on its feet, not cheering but honoring. Afterward, a man in a suit approached him. "We'd like to fund your outreach program," he said. "Expand it to 10 cities." Mateo didn't say yes right away. "Only if the kids help design it," he replied. "Only if it stays real," the man nodded. "Fair enough." Back home, life remained ordinary in the best possible way. His mother still worked nights, but now she smiled more. She'd started taking adult beginner piano classes at the community center, just for fun. Sometimes, when Mateo practiced at home, she'd sit on the couch and play along on her tiny keyboard, their melodies weaving together like conversation. One evening, she played a simple tune, a lullaby from her childhood. It was slow, full of mistakes, but full of love. He joined in, harmonizing gently. When they finished, she looked at him and said, "You taught me that music isn't just for the gifted. It's for the willing." He hugged her. "You taught me that long before I knew it." At Juilliard, Mateo was no longer the odd one out, not because he'd changed to fit in, but because the school had begun to change around him. New students arrived with stories like his, self-taught, under-resourced, fiercely passionate. And when they walked into the audition hall, nervous and unsure, they found a panel that listened differently. Director Whitmore still ran the program, but she'd stepped back from the spotlight. She mentored quietly now, focused on building systems that lasted beyond any one student. She'd even started writing a book, not about technique, but about listening. She never mentioned Mateo by name, but everyone who read it knew. One spring afternoon, nearly 2 years after that first audition, Mateo returned to the Grand Hall, not to perform, but to watch. A new student was auditioning. A girl, maybe 12, in a hand-me-down dress clutching a single sheet of paper. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play a piece she'd learned from videos. It wasn't perfect. Her timing wavered. Her left hand lagged, but her heart was in every note. From the back of the room, Mateo watched the panel. He saw the same skepticism he'd once faced. Then the same shift, the same dawning wonder. And when she finished, Director Whitmore didn't laugh. She simply said, "Tell me your story." Later, as the girl left the room, eyes wide with hope, Mateo caught up to her in the hallway. "You were amazing," he said. She looked down, shy. "I messed up the middle part." "So did I," he said. "They still let me in." She looked up, eyes searching his face. "Really?" "Really." He handed her a small notebook, filled not with scales but with blank staff paper and a note on the first page. "Your voice matters. Start here." She took it like it was gold. That night, Mateo sat at his piano again. The city hummed outside. His mother dozed on the couch. The same as always. But everything was different. He played a new piece, one he'd written himself. No title yet, just a melody that rose from the quiet space between fear and faith, between where he'd been and where he was going. It wasn't for an audition, it wasn't for a gala, it wasn't even for an audience. It was for the boy who once stood in a hallway, too scared to walk in, for the woman who worked nights so he could dream, for the teacher who listened when no one else would, for every kid still waiting for their chance. And as the notes filled the room, imperfect, honest, alive, he knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning, because music like this doesn't end with a final chord. It echoes. And somewhere, in another apartment, in another city, another child pressed their ear to a wall, heard a distant piano, and dared to believe. That's how it spreads. Not with fame, not with perfection, but with one true note at a time.